Howdy, historians. How's it going? Welcome to China Part 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. China Part 4. All kinds of amazing history that we've seen so far. So we've seen some of the important ideas that influenced China. We've seen some of the important dynasties. Last time you listened to that English guy talk way too fast about the First and Second Opium Wars, as we're looking at the Chang dynasty here, and the last dynasty in the line of dynasties. So, just a little recap here. As we're talking about the First and Second Opium War, what we're really talking about there, what the big issues in the First and Second Opium War, it's trade. Right? It's trade and it's outside influence. Those are the biggest things that are going on. And that was one problem with the Chang dynasty, is that they weren't able to regulate trade as well as dynasties were before them. And that's really what led to the First and Second Opium War. You know, before the 1800s, when the Opium Wars start, China had always put really strict regulations on trade. They put stricter regulations on like where trade could happen, on how much trade could occur, to always make sure that they had a favorable trade balance, to make sure that they were always exporting more than they were importing, and to make sure that they were always making money and not having too much foreign influence. But basically, the Chang dynasty lost the ability to do that because they had sloppy leadership and poor leadership that just wasn't really strong enough to keep everything in line like they should. So trade was a big issue, and as we started to see more trade occur, more foreign influence occurred, then we see these wars with the First and Second Opium Wars, where, you know, the British basically just dominate because of their military technology, and they're able to gain more influence over China than France, Russia, and the United States join along with England, and they start to have influence as well. You know, and the big idea at the end of the Second Opium War that hopefully you picked up on is that Europeans and the United States were showing the Chinese and everyone else in Southeast Asia like who was really in charge. It wasn't going to be the indigenous, the native people of Southeast Asia anymore. It was going to be the United States, Russia, France, England, the Dutch to a lesser extent. Those were going to be the people who were in charge, and it was all about economics. Those European and American powers needed places to sell their goods, and they needed new stuff to buy, like the British were nuts for tea. Right? And then they need to sell them opium to maintain a good trade balance for them. So the First and Second Opium War were devastatingly negative for the Chang dynasty, where now the people in China are starting to become upset with their rulers and starting to become upset with the amount of foreign influence that's taking place in their country, which leads us to the Boxer Rebellion. Now, the Boxer Rebellion gets its name because there is this group in Japan that got going in the 1890s called the Righteous Harmonious Fists. The Righteous Harmonious Fists. They practiced martial arts, so to Westerners they looked like boxers, right? They didn't. Someone from Britain, France, Russia, they didn't know what martial arts were, so they just called them boxers. So the actual name of the group was the Righteous Harmonious Fists. Europeans just called them boxers, so now we just know it as the Boxer Rebellion. Now, the Boxers were Chinese citizens. They were upset over the growing influence of outside foreign powers in China. So they started this rebellion with the goal to drive out Europeans. They wanted to get Europeans, Japanese, anyone else who was in China that wasn't Chinese, they wanted them out. Because China was changing a lot with all of this influence from outside powers. Before you know it, they're building factories, they're building, just like normal buildings in their spheres of influence that don't follow Chinese architectural standards. They're starting to, bring modern machines, telegraph lines, other types of inventions, and they're changing the culture. Right, so the Boxers saw all this foreign influence as un-Chinese, and they wanted to get all of these groups out. And there were lots of European powers that had influence in China at this time. Everything in the yellow here, that's the French, where they have control. Everything in the green, that's where the British control. The purple are the Japanese. The orangey salmon is the Germans. The pink are the Russians. So probably over 50% of China is under foreign control at this time, basically, because in these spheres of influence, the Europeans can do whatever they want. The Chang Empire had no ability to stop them from, following laws or preventing them from taking over the economy. That was the whole reason why they were there, was to take over the economy. So the Chang Empire couldn't check the power of these Europeans, and these Europeans were just taking over China, doing whatever they want. bringing armies, setting up factories, setting up their own legal systems, setting up their own police. So the Qing dynasty was unable to check the power of Europeans and to end the foreign influence that these Europeans had. So the Boxers rose up, and they were pretty successful in the early days. They had some victories. They were able to start pushing Europeans around a little bit. They definitely started to push the Qing dynasty around a little bit too. And eventually they were so successful, the Qing dynasty even kind of like on the down low supported the Boxers, thinking, hey, maybe they could just get rid of all these Europeans for us since we hadn't been able to do it before. But eventually Japan got all of the outside powers organized. So Japan and European countries got together, they made a united army, and they defeated the Boxer Rebellion. So the Boxer Rebellion lasted from 1899 to 1901, but it showed that the people were upset with this outside influence in China, and the people were upset with the Qing dynasty because the dynasty couldn't do anything to stop this foreign influence. And then at the end of the Boxer Rebellion, China had to make a lot more concessions to all of these outside powers, Japan and all of these European nations. They had to allow for more economic trade. They had to open trade up more. They had to allow for more spheres of influence to be created. There was more economic modernization that a lot of the Chinese people didn't want. And society started to see a lot of changes too. We started to see a more industrial, that's like a more factory-based economy. That has tons of changes on society. Your education system is going to change. Also, a lot of the things they were teaching in their educational system started to change after the Boxer Rebellion. Instead of like teaching the ideas of Confucius and the things that, had really influenced Chinese history, they started to focus more on Western history, and they started to move away from Confucianism, which was kind of the dominant religion at this time, and more towards Christianity. So there were lots of societal changes, but like on the down low, the citizens were not happy about this and were very upset with all of these changes. So the Boxers were defeated, but a spirit of nationalism started to rise up. The people of China saw all these changes that were being forced on them, and they started to become more nationalistic. Nationalism increased, pride in one's country. They started to see themselves more as Chinese instead of just like citizens of their local areas, which they had kind of seen themselves as before. And you started to see some people form like these early revolutionary groups that were eventually going to be able to overthrow these European powers and start to change things for the good for the Chinese people. So as the Boxer Rebellion ends and this nationalism is on the uptick, like I was just saying, this leads to the end of the dynasties. So the Qing dynasty ended in 1911. There was actually a lot of chaos from like 1908 to 1911. The last true emperor of the Qing dynasty died in 1908, and then a 2-year-old inherited the throne. A 2-year-old, right? Like Joey's 2.5, he cannot run a country, right? He can hardly eat his lunch. He can't even go to the bathroom in a toilet yet, right? So there was all this chaos for like 3 years when the last emperor died. And then in December of 1911, a leader from this group called the Revolutionary Alliance came forward and started to change China and change their political system. And again, it was about these feelings of nationalism, trying to free China from foreign influence, trying to create more of a representative government, and trying to really have an economic stability for all Chinese citizens. So we see the end of dynasties in 1911, and then that leads us into, skip that one, the Republic of China, which we'll see from 1911 till about 1914. Excuse me, I should have said 1911, 1949. Little slip up there. So for a while, China will be called the Republic of China. I'm just going to adjust this a little bit here, bring this down. All right, this is actually the flag for the Republic of China, very different than just the red flag that they'll eventually adopt when they become a communist country, right? But lots of different colors to represent all the different people of China. So that was their flag when they became the Republic of China. All right, so it's very different than the flag that we know today. Now, although they were able to establish themselves as this new form of government, this republic, with voting and democracy, it never quite worked. Honestly, there was basically constant civil war from 1911 until 1949, or at least like constant turmoil, because there'll be a period of time where it isn't quite civil war, but there's still war. So the people who took over, the Revolutionary Alliance, tried to institute a republic, basically democracy. But it was really hard because the people weren't used to it. So there was this constant civil war that was occurring. And eventually what you see is this leader named Mao Zedong rise to power. he is going to be a communist, and him and his communists are going to have a lot of appeal for the people of China. And that's what we'll talk about a lot in next lecture, is the communist takeover, and then a lot of the changes that they put in place. Once they come in, they start to institute communism. But a lot of the civil war that we saw was between Mao Zedong and the communists, and then other people who were trying to put a republic in China, people from that old revolutionary alliance. So it's communists versus people who are trying to institute democracy and republicanism. But eventually the communists are going to be the ones that rise to victory, but it's going to take a little bit. At one point, both sides actually united together in World War II. So during World War II, actually, Japan took over all of China, and it was brutal. It was nasty, nasty fighting. I mean, there's a lot of dark history out there that you can read about it. But when the Japanese took over China during World War II, you actually saw the communists and the Republicans unite together to fight against the Japanese during that time period. So we saw a brief moment of stability. The two sides united together, and it was actually pretty early on, before the true start of World War II as we know it from like European history. So from 1931 to 1945, the two sides united together to try to drive out the Japanese, and then after Japan fell at the end of the war in 1945, then the war was back on. But the communists went out. After the war ends in 1945, you can see just by the dates that I have up here that the communists are going to take control and win in 1949 under the leadership of Mao Zedong. So lots of changes going on. That's what we really see today. And a lot of talk about foreign influence again, outside influence, as we think about kind of wrapping up the dynasties and the Republic of China. China has been historically one of the strongest, most advanced civilizations that the world has ever known and that history has ever seen. For most of world history, they're honestly probably the most advanced civilization out of any civilization in the world. They were better than the Greeks. Roman Empire, it challenges the Chinese, but the Chinese were actually advanced in a lot of their military and technological advancements in comparison to the Romans, and a lot of the dynasties actually and the emperors covered more geographic space. So, but they're better than the Greeks for sure. They rival the Romans. They're better than any European country, more advanced than any European civilization, more advanced than any of the American civilizations, especially when you look at their technology and the things that they were creating and the geographic area that they were able to dominate. So China had been really successful, but they had these waves. And it would be like a wave of prosperity would come when they'd have a really strong centralized government that was using legalism. And then there'd be a little downtick in their history and there'd be decentralization and no one would use legalism. And then someone would rise up and use legalism and unite everybody together and keep foreign influence out or limit foreign influence. All right? Because like the Ming Dynasty was really successful in trading, but they were able to limit the outside influence as they traded. Right? They were able to set up really strict rules and really harsh punishment so that no one messed with the trade pacts that they made. So China had this complex history where they were incredibly advanced as long as they kept outside influence in check. That's the way that they saw it. But then in the late 1700s and in the 1800s, in the Qing Dynasty, things start to become unraveled. The Qing Dynasty is weak. They're not able to use legalism well enough. All of this outside influence comes in. You have the First and Second Opium Wars. You have the Boxer Rebellion. You have some other little rebellions we didn't even talk about. And all these things caused dishonor in the eyes of the Chinese people because they were dominated by outside powers and they weren't able to make their own decisions. The Republic of China rises up, but then it leads to civil war. And the Republic of China and the civil war that is being fought under their leadership allows the Japanese to come in and take over for 14 years, and then it's even more dishonor. And then they drive the Japanese out, and then they have to finish their civil war from 1945 to 1949, and then the communists take over, and boy, are they going to use legalism. Right? They're not going to call it that. They're going to call it communism. And they're going to do things differently. But Mao Zedong and the communists, when they come in, are going to create an ultra-powerful centralized government where men are more important than women and where elders are very respected in society and the old outweigh the power of the young. All these ideas we've been talking about, they come back when the communists come into play. And then they'll be kind of like hit and miss successful, but then we'll see that they will also become incredibly successful right around 1990. But that'll be later on in the unit. Okay, so good job today. Quick little quiz on what we did. So hop over to the assignment section. See you next time. Adios.